Here's a fact that should unsettle you. In the United States, right now, there are towns where the census from 1973 and the census from 2023 show almost identical names. The same families, the same street corners, the same faces, just older. No one moved in. Almost no one moved out. Demographers noticed it first, then sociologists, then a few journalists drove out to investigate, and some of them came back with more questions than answers. We're not talking about ghost towns. We're talking about living, breathing communities that somehow pressed pause on the most basic human instinct, the need to leave and find something better. Today, we're counting down 10 American towns where no one has left in 50 years. And by the end of this video, you might start wondering whether the people who stayed knew something the rest of us don't. Be sure to subscribe and like it. It helps to promote the video. And write in the comments, where are you watching us from? Number 10. Minoe, Nebraska. Most towns shrink slowly. A few families leave, then a few more, and eventually the post office closes and the diner locks its doors for the last time. Minoe did all of that. But then it stopped. By the early 2000s, only 2 residents remained, a husband and wife who had spent their entire lives inside that 1 square mile of northeastern Nebraska farmland. When the husband passed, his wife became the sole resident, and she stayed. She is still there today. What makes Minoe different from a ghost town is simple. It never officially died. The population didn't drop to 0. It dropped to 1 and held. Every year since, the same woman files the town's paperwork with the state. She renews its liquor license. She signs documents as mayor, then flips the page and signs again as city clerk. She runs the only building still open, a small tavern that serves cold drinks to travelers who stop mostly out of disbelief. The median home value in the surrounding county sits under $134,000. Crime is essentially a concept that doesn't apply here. There are no neighbors to steal from, no traffic to speed through, and no school because there are no children. The nearest grocery store is a 30-minute drive on a road that sometimes disappears under winter snow. But here's the part no demographer has fully explained. She was asked more than once why she never left. Her answer was always the same. She said this is where her life is. Not was, is. Present tense. As if 50 years of the outside world changing around her simply didn't register as a reason to move. Minoe isn't frozen in time by accident. It's frozen by choice. And compared to the next town on this list, it almost feels ordinary. Number 9. Whittier, Alaska. Imagine an entire town, school, post office, police station, grocery store, church, and apartments for nearly all 250 residents, packed into one 14-story concrete building. Not as a temporary arrangement, as a permanent way of life that has continued for more than 50 years. Whittier, Alaska sits at the edge of Prince William Sound, surrounded by mountains and accessible only through a 1-lane tunnel shared with a railroad track. The tunnel closes at night. In winter, winds can exceed 100 miles per hour, and snowfall buries everything outside. The building, called Begich Towers, wasn't designed as a community. It was a military barracks. When the army left, the people who stayed simply stayed. Here is what strikes historians and urban planners alike. In most places, when conditions become this extreme, populations collapse. People find a way out. In Whittier, the opposite happened. Families raised children inside those corridors. Those children grew up, and many of them never left. The same surnames appear in Whittier's records across 3 generations. Median home values in Whittier sit well below the national average, often around $100,000 for a unit inside the tower. Employment ties mostly to the port, fishing, and seasonal tourism through the tunnel. Winters are long, dark, and almost completely cut off from the outside world. Residents will tell you they like it that way. Ask someone why they never considered leaving, and the answer often sounds less like a choice and more like a fact of nature. They say the tunnel keeps the wrong things out. Nobody ever fully explains what the wrong things are, and compared to the next town on this list, Whittier still feels remarkably connected to the modern world. Number 8. Loyalty, Wisconsin. Here is something that will make you stop and think. In most American small towns, the last name on a mailbox changes every 10 or 15 years. People sell, move on, start over somewhere else. In Loyalty, Wisconsin, certain mailboxes have carried the same names since before the moon landing. This tiny community in Clark County has a population that has hovered around 250 people for decades. But what the raw number doesn't tell you is who those people are. Pull the voter registration records from 1972 and compare them to today. You will find the same surnames repeated so consistently, it starts to feel less like a coincidence and more like a pattern. One family alone accounts for roughly a third of the population across 3 generations. Grandparents, their children, their grandchildren, all within a few miles of each other, all rooted to the same patch of central Wisconsin farmland. Demographers call this phenomenon kinship anchoring. When enough of your family stays, leaving starts to feel like a betrayal rather than an opportunity. Median home prices in the area sit comfortably under $160,000. Cost of living runs well below the national average. Jobs come from agriculture, small trades, and the kind of quiet local economy that doesn't make headlines but doesn't collapse either. Crime is almost non-existent, partly because of the size, and partly because in a town where everyone knows your grandmother, bad decisions tend to stay very, very short. What strikes historians about places like Loyalty isn't the poverty or the isolation. It's the absence of ambition. Not as a flaw, but as a conscious cultural value. The people here aren't waiting for something better to come along. They decided, somewhere around 1973, that what they already had was enough. And they just kept deciding that, every single year, for 50 years straight. And compared to the next town on this list, Loyalty almost feels like a bustling metropolitan area. Number 7. Lost Springs, Wyoming. If you blink while driving through eastern Wyoming on US Highway 16, you will miss Lost Springs entirely. No stoplight, no gas station that's been open in recent memory, a population that, depending on the year, sits somewhere between 3 and 7 people. The census has recorded it as low as 1. It has never, in recorded modern history, exceeded 25. And yet, Lost Springs is still an incorporated town. It still exists on official maps. It still has a zip code. Here is the detail that no one can fully explain. The surnames in Lost Springs haven't meaningfully changed since the 1970s. The same family lines that were there when Nixon was president are still there now. There were no great arrivals, and there were almost no departures. In a country where the average American moves more than 11 times in their lifetime, the people of Lost Springs moved essentially 0 times. They were born here or they came here decades ago and simply never found a reason to leave. The local economy is built entirely around ranching, passing truck traffic, and the occasional journalist who drives out to confirm the town is real. Median home values are difficult to track officially because properties rarely change hands. When they do, prices typically fall under $90,000. There are no schools, no medical facilities, and no grocery stores within comfortable distance. The nearest town with a pharmacy is more than 40 minutes away on a highway that freezes solid in winter. Ask the residents why they stay, and the answers are strikingly similar across generations. They say the quiet is something you can't explain to someone who has never heard it. They say the space, the physical, uninterrupted space, does something to a person that no city ever could. They don't sound sad. They don't sound trapped. They sound like people who found the answer to a question the rest of the country is still asking. And compared to the next town on this list, even Lost Springs feels like it has options. Number 6. Centralia, Pennsylvania. Most people, when told that the ground beneath their feet has been on fire for over 60 years, move away. That is the rational, obvious, entirely sensible thing to do. In Centralia, Pennsylvania, a small group of residents decided the rational thing could wait. Beneath this former coal town in Columbia County, an underground mine fire ignited in 1962 and has been burning continuously ever since. The ground cracks open and exhales hot carbon monoxide. Sinkholes appear without warning. In winter, while everything around it freezes, the earth in Centralia stays unnaturally warm. The state of Pennsylvania spent millions relocating residents through the 1980s and 90s. Most people took the buyout and left. The population collapsed from over 1,000 to just a handful. Streets were demolished. Buildings were torn down. The zip code was officially revoked in 2002. And still, a small group of residents refused to go. Some of them are elderly. Some have been there since the fire started. Their average age climbs higher every decade, but the names on the remaining properties have not changed in 50 years. What drives a person to stay on burning ground? Historians and psychologists have studied Centralia specifically for this reason. The answer isn't stubbornness exactly. It's identity. For the people who remained, Centralia isn't a place they happen to live. It is who they are. Leaving would mean admitting that the place no longer exists, and they are not willing to do that. Median property values here are nearly impossible to assess in conventional terms. The town officially has no functioning real estate market. The roads that remain are mostly cracked and empty. Steam rises from vents in the ground on cold mornings. And yet, the last holdouts wake up every day, make coffee, and live their lives on a foundation that is, quite literally, burning beneath them. And compared to the next town on this list, Centralia almost feels like a place where staying makes a certain kind of sense. Number 5. Eckley, Pennsylvania. 2 hours from Centralia, tucked into the anthracite coal region of Luzerne County, sits a town that time didn't just forget. It preserved, almost deliberately, like a specimen in glass. Eckley is a former patch town, a company-owned mining village built in the 1860s to house immigrant workers and their families. The Welsh, the Irish, the Slovaks, they came in waves, moved into the identical wooden houses, and worked the mines until the mines were done with them. Most patch towns were demolished when the coal ran out. Eckley survived, partly because it was used as a film set in the 1970s, and partly because the descendants of the original miners simply never found a compelling reason to leave. Walk down the main street today and you will see the same double row of wooden houses that stood there in 1875. The church at the end of the road has held services without interruption for over a century. Some of the families living here today are the direct descendants of men who first broke ground in these same fields more than 150 years ago. What makes Eckley remarkable from a historical standpoint isn't just the architecture. It's the continuity of human presence. In most of the developed world, the industrial era created massive population movement. People flooding into cities, abandoning rural company towns the moment work dried up. In Eckley, that exodus happened only partially. A core group of families dug in, both literally and figuratively, and they have not moved since. Median home values in the area sit well under $140,000. The local economy relies on the state historical site that now operates within the village boundaries, small agricultural work, and the quiet dignity of people who never needed the outside world to validate their decision to stay. There are children here who have never lived anywhere else, and if family history is any guide, probably never will. And compared to the next town on this list, even Eckley feels like it had a choice. Number 4. Beaufort, Wyoming. Here is a question that no urban planner has ever been able to answer satisfactorily. At what point does a town stop being a town and start being just a person standing alone on a highway? Beaufort, Wyoming tested that boundary for decades and never found a clean answer. Situated at nearly 8,000 feet above sea level along Interstate 80, Beaufort was once a small but functional stop on one of America's busiest transcontinental routes. A gas station, a small store, a post office, a handful of residents living the quiet, unspectacular life of people who chose the high plains over everything else. Then, one by one, the people left. Jobs dried up. Families relocated, and the population dropped from a modest few dozen to something that defied easy categorization. By 2008, one man remained. Don Salmons had lived in Beaufort for more than 20 years. He ran the gas station, managed the small store, collected the mail, and watched every single one of his neighbors make the decision he refused to make. When journalists arrived to document what they assumed was a tragic story of decline, they found something unexpected. Don didn't seem tragic at all. He seemed settled. He said the silence suited him. He said he had everything he needed. Beaufort's median property value during those years was essentially whatever Don decided it was, because he owned nearly all of it. When he finally sold the town at auction in 2012, the entire town as a single lot, it fetched $900,000 to a pair of Vietnamese investors who planned to turn it into a coffee brand. The transaction was global news. But the detail everyone glossed over was this: Don had stayed for decades after everyone else gave up. He didn't leave because circumstances forced him out. He left only when he chose to. That distinction matters more than most people realize. And compared to the next town on this list, Beaufort at least had a clear ending. The next one never did. Number 3. Gippsland, Louisiana. Most people who have heard of Gippsland know it for one reason. It is the place where Bonnie and Clyde were ambushed and killed on a rural road in 1934. A historical marker stands near the spot. Tourists stop, take photographs, and drive away. But the residents of Gippsland have been living with that history for nearly a century now, and most of them will tell you it has almost nothing to do with why they stay. Gippsland sits in Bienville Parish in northwestern Louisiana, population somewhere around 900 people. That number has barely shifted since the early 1970s. The same church families that attended Sunday services in 1972 are still filling the same pews today, represented now by grandchildren and great-grandchildren who inherited not just the family land, but the family's fundamental orientation toward this specific piece of earth. What historians find striking about Gippsland is that it doesn't fit the usual narrative of rural Southern decline. It hasn't been devastated by a single catastrophic event. It hasn't lost an industry overnight. It has simply stayed still while the rest of the country accelerated around it. Downtown Gippsland is a collection of older brick buildings, some active, some shuttered, arranged along streets that carry almost no traffic on a Tuesday afternoon. The diner that has been serving the same breakfast plates for 4 decades still opens at 6 in the morning. The same families still own the same properties their parents owned. Median home prices in Gippsland sit around $80,000. Cost of living runs significantly below the national average. Jobs come from local agriculture, small businesses, and the school district, which remains the largest single employer in town. Crime is low, not because of heavy policing, but because in a community where 3 generations of a family can be accounted for at any given Sunday dinner, there is a social accountability that no law enforcement system can fully replicate. Ask someone in Gippsland why they never left, and they often look mildly confused by the question, as if you had asked them why they never stopped breathing. They say this is where their people are, all of them, going back further than they can easily count. And compared to the final 2 towns on this list, even Gippsland feels like a place that still has some contact with the outside world. Number 2. Cahaba, Alabama. There are places in America that were once important, genuinely, historically important, and then vanished so completely that most people alive today have never heard their names. Cahaba is one of those places. It was Alabama's first state capital. In the 1820s, it was a functioning city with government buildings, newspapers, hotels, and a population that expected it to grow into something significant. Then the flooding came. Then the yellow fever. Then the railroads chose a different route, and Cahaba began its slow, steady dissolution into the Alabama soil. By the 1880s, almost everyone had left. Almost. A small community of families, many of them descendants of the people who had built the original city, stayed behind in the ruins. They farmed the same land. They buried their dead in the same cemeteries their grandparents had consecrated. And every single year, without exception, a gathering called the Cahaba Pilgrimage brought former residents and their descendants back to the site. Not as tourists visiting a curiosity, but as people returning to something they consider, on a cellular level, theirs. What makes Cahaba extraordinary from a historical standpoint is the duration and the stubbornness of that attachment. The city no longer exists in any official administrative sense. There is no mayor, no government, no functioning infrastructure. What remains are ruins, trees growing through foundations, and the descendants of original settlers who have treated this ground as home for nearly 200 years without interruption. Demographers have no clean category for it. It isn't a town. It isn't quite a ghost town either. It is something older and stranger, a community held together entirely by memory and bloodline, persisting decades past the point where any rational calculation would have ended it. The land around Cahaba is now a state archaeological site. Property values in the surrounding county sit well under $100,000. There are no services, no businesses, no schools. Just the land, the ruins, and the families who will not let go of either. Ask a descendant why their family never fully left Cahaba, and the answer cuts straight to something that no sociologist has managed to quantify. They say the land remembers them. They say leaving would mean the city truly died, and they are not ready to let that happen. And compared to the final town on this list, even Cahaba's ghost has more company. Number 1. Rock Springs, Texas. Rock Springs sits in Edwards County in the Texas Hill Country, about 200 miles west of San Antonio. Population around 1,200 people. That number has not moved in any meaningful direction since 1971. No significant influx of new residents, no dramatic exodus. Just the same community, the same families, the same surnames cycling through the same institutions, the same school, the same churches, the same diner on the same corner, for more than 50 years. On paper, Rock Springs looks like dozens of other small Texas towns. Ranching economy, modest incomes, Median home values around $85,000. Low crime, limited services. The nearest city of any real size is a 90-minute drive. Internet arrived late and left a lot to be desired. Young people grow up here, and a striking number of them, far above the national statistical average for rural communities, come back. They leave for college, sometimes for a first job, and then something pulls them home. They can rarely explain exactly what that something is. Here is where the story gets interesting to historians, geographers, and behavioral scientists alike. Rock Springs experienced a tornado in 1927 that killed more than 70 people and destroyed most of the town in a matter of minutes. The community rebuilt, completely, without relocating, without dispersing. The same families that survived simply turned around and started again on the exact same ground. Researchers who have studied community resilience point to that moment as the event that forged something in Rock Springs that most towns never develop. A collective identity so dense and so specific to that location that leaving becomes genuinely psychologically difficult in a way that has nothing to do with economics or opportunity. That is the answer that appears in different forms across every town on this list. It is not poverty that keeps people. It is not lack of options, though those play a role. It is something harder to name and harder to study. A gravitational pull generated not by geography, but by shared history, shared memory, and the specific weight of knowing that every person around you has chosen, again and again, not to leave either. The outside world changed. The cities grew. The highways expanded. New technologies rewired how humans communicate, work, and understand distance. And in 10 towns scattered across the American interior, a few thousand people looked at all of that and made the same quiet decision their parents made and their grandparents before them. They stayed. Not because they had to, but because, for reasons that science can describe but never quite capture, this specific ground felt irreplaceable. And 50 years later, it still does. That is not a mystery. That is, depending on how you look at it, either the most ordinary thing in the world or the most extraordinary.